Good morning. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Amen. Yes, I forgot to say it last week, and I apologize. But this is an awesome day for us to rejoice in. As Dwight mentioned, it's a day that we've been looking forward to for a long time. And so I just hope we're going to be able to communicate the kind of enthusiasm that we want to share with you. We're all a part of this together, so we're going to have some exciting ideas and thoughts and challenges to share this morning. It was Aesop who coined the phrase, good things come in small packages. Good things come in small packages. And even though he lived at about the time of the writing of this Old Testament book, I'm pretty certain that he wasn't thinking about Haggai when he said that good things come in small packages, but certainly it would be appropriate. Haggai has only 2 chapters. It's between the Z's, Zephaniah and Zechariah, and it's probably not a often read. And I'm thinking that you're probably wondering, so we're going to be talking about Renewal Sunday, kind of getting a new beginning, a new start, new challenges. Why in the world would we be looking at the book of Haggai on Renewal Sunday? I mean, what message could a book that was written 500 years before the birth of Jesus possibly have to do with us today in the 21st century? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's not actually a book that I can tell you that I've often read. In fact, I'm trying to think if I've ever even been in a Bible class where we actually focused on the book of Haggai for more than maybe just a reference to it. It's not a name we hear often. I mean, we are thrilled that Blake and Madison Riojas gave birth to their son last Thursday, but they didn't name him Haggai. His name is Nick, and congratulations, Brian and Gina. Look at there. Welcome to the Grandparent Club. So we're thrilled with them. I have to tell you that, and I really wish I could kind of point back to the moment, and it really wasn't a moment, but and don't take this wrong, but there was something that the Spirit just moved me and just pointed me to look at Haggai, and the more time I spent in Haggai, the more it occurred to me that I have done God a great injustice by not spending more time looking at the thoughts that he has to share in this 2-chapter book. And so this morning, we're just going to look at some things here, because what I would tell you and I am a history nut, and I apologize. So I'll just make it a 30-second historical narrative just so we can be all up to speed as far as what's going on when Haggai, one of the minor prophets, called minor because it's short, what he was addressing. The clan of Judah, the tribe of Judah, was in exile. Babylonian had defeated them. They were in exile. They were no longer at home. And so you can imagine how it felt to be totally dislocated. But now Persia has defeated Babylonia, and as a result of that, the clan, the tribe of Judah, has returned home. So there's the historical background, the historical narrative. They're no longer in exile. Now, at the risk of probably taking liberties with this analogy, it just kind of has occurred to me that over the last 2 years, we have been kind of in exile as well. We've experienced some isolation from one another. There have been a lot of things that we have been accustomed to doing together with friends and family, including our spiritual family here, that because of COVID and other things, we were not able to do. And so in some respects, I think we can kind of relate to this feeling of exile, at least on a spiritual level, if not on a physical level. And we're going to see in this book that God's message to his people who have returned home is one of renewal. It's one of renewal. We're going to have to kind of get started up again and get back on track with what we have always been known to do, those who are listening to Haggai's voice, as well as what we have always been accustomed to doing as a church family that maybe we have not had the opportunity to do. But I want you to notice how the book begins in chapter 1, verse 2. Listen to what God says through Haggai. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. Now, the clan of Judah has been back for 15 years now. And for 15 years, they have pretty much ignored the temple that had been built under Solomon's reign, and it is in complete shambles, it is in disarray, and the people are continuing to say, well, I guess it's just not time yet to rebuild the Lord's house. And yet that temple, for those people, it represented God's power, it represented his presence, it represented his peace. And the fact that it was still in shambles would have told people that apparently God is not important, because they have not paid attention at all to the rebuilding of that house that had been built in Solomon's reign. But you know, there's always going to be a better time to do things, right? Especially if it's not something you really like to do very well. And so it's easy to procrastinate. It's easy to put things off. And as a result, sometimes we start feeling discouragement and a helpless feeling and a hopeless feeling. But you know, God has different ideas. He has a different timetable for his people. And this is one of those comments that he's going to make where it's kind of like, I'm going to be in your face. I'm going to tell you exactly how I see it. And I just want to see how you are going to respond with the challenge that I'm going to issue to you. And you see that in Haggai chapter 1, verse 4. This is God through Haggai talking to the people. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? Now, paraphrasing, really, can you feel good about that? You've been back for 15 years, and you've been making sure your houses are all in order. Everything looks good. Everything's in its place. And what are you doing with my house? You've ignored it. You've overlooked it. You haven't given it any time or any thought. So God poses this question that is very incisive. It's very direct. It's no beating around the bush. I mean, he is calling a spade a spade. And it never hurts for God to do that with us here today, too. That there's never any harm in God always being very straightforward and forthright with us. And so God is going to share through Haggai what it means to be on the road to renewal. And it's really so much more than rebuilding the temple, which, by the way, they will do. And of course, we're not talking about the importance of this as a temple. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But it is important for us to recognize that when God speaks, he expects a response. He expects action on our part. And he's speaking to us through Haggai. The very first thing he says in verse 7, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Give careful thought to your ways. He also says that back in verse 5, same thing, give careful thought to your ways. So the very first thing he says, I want you to just stop and reflect. I want you to think about where you've been prioritizing, where you've been focusing, what you've been spending and expending energy to do, and I want you to examine it. In business terms, we might say, take inventory. Paul would say in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, examine yourselves, test yourselves. Do you not realize that Jesus Christ is in you? A self-examination or looking into ourselves just to be able to continue to fan the flames of self-centeredness or selfishness, but in terms of how am I contributing to God's work, to God's kingdom? How am I impacting people in my life? And it's interesting because in 5 and 6, listen to what he says. Since you haven't really been given thought to your ways, I just kind of want you to see what you've been experiencing in verse 5. You planted much, but harvested a little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You put on clothes, but you're not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. What God is saying is, look what you've chosen. You've chosen a lifestyle that does not have godly purpose. It's just about you. And how frustrating is that? I think about that little mouse running the wheel, just round and round and round and round and never going anywhere. And that's kind of what he's describing here. So he says, I want you to give thought to your ways and ask yourself, where are your priorities? How are you using those abilities and talents that I've given to you? The second thing he says in verse 8, go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. So now he's transitioning from this time of thought, reflection, self-examination, and he says, now I have a call to action. And it's an interesting call to action, especially as it relates to building the temple, because he doesn't say, in your pews, and if you'll stay on your couches, it'll get done. It'll get rebuilt. And he doesn't just say, why don't you just send a few people up there when it's convenient for them and see if they can find some timber. No, he says, you go up into the mountains to find this timber, and I want all of you to do it. Now, we may not be all timber carriers. I can imagine, like, in that assignment that Rick Huddleston would make sure that we had plenty of refreshments. I would say Jerry and Diane Jeffries and Denise Cook, Renee O'Donnell would be sure that we had cards of encouragement. Okay, you can do this, you can do this. And I'm sure that Mindy Loomis would make sure that it's well advertised and it has good public relations and everybody needs to do it. And then you'd have the big, strong, able-bodied guys like Terry and Chris Stubbs and Gary Thompson and Steve Smith and David Elastic. They're going to carry all the tools and the timber, and everybody would have their part, but everybody's going to go up there and get this timber. And by the way, just completely as a side note, and I would never want to really throw Chris Stubbs under the bus, but I do have to share this story because it just seemed to kind of work in here. Several years ago, Chris, my dear friend, neighbor, he calls me up one day. This is many years ago when I actually was even healthier. And he said, hey, this Saturday, I'm going to go get a rick of wood. We're going to go get a rick of wood. You want to go with me? And I said, yeah, I'm all in. Let's go do that. I'm thinking we're going to go someplace and have them loaded up on the truck and bring it back. And we get out here in the middle of nowhere in Boone, Oklahoma, and all you're looking around, I'm looking at all these trees, and I'm thinking, I think I'm starting to get an idea here. And the first thing I remember Chris doing is he gets out this huge old chainsaw, and I'm thinking, that's what I'm talking about. I mean, I'm ready to get that bad boy going. And he sets it aside, and he turns around and he hands me an axe and a splitter. Have you ever had to use an axe and a splitter for about 4 hours on wood while your buddy over here is using this chainsaw and just cutting it through? I mean, longest 4 hours of my life. So if it were me going up to get the timber, I wouldn't let Chris be in charge because I know what he'd have me do. But the important thing is that it was a collective effort that these people were going to be engaged in. Now, reality is this. Did God need a house? I mean, really, was this about God? Was this about God saying, you know, I'm just kind of like I'm a nomad. I don't have a place to sleep at night. Obviously, that is a ridiculous thought. In fact, we know that Paul would tell the Athenians in Acts chapter 17, verse 24, that God does not live in temple built by human hands. God does not live in buildings or temples we can build. But what he's saying is that when we invest ourselves in things that bring honor and bring pleasure to God, then we're the ones who are being blessed. We're the ones who are understanding what it means to have godly purpose and to give ourselves to something much greater than ourselves. The people really needed to be able to rebuild that temple to be reminded of where priorities are. God didn't need that temple, but God was glad that we pursued that. So God says, be careful. Give careful thought to your ways. And then I want you to have a response to that and a plan of action. Now that you've determined that and assessed that, what's going to be the next thing for those people? Into the mountains to get wood, to get timber. But then the third thing he says in verse 12. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the whole remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord their God. The thing that was really impressed upon the people was the importance of obeying the voice of God. We hear a lot of voices in a lot of different ways throughout our lives. whether it be from politics or education, whether it be from social clubs. In any venue, there are voices that are demanding our time and asking for us to give of ourselves to it. But if there is a voice that must always rise above, that's why Peter said, we have chosen to obey God rather than men. That must be our resolve and our calling as well. You see, obedience and obeying God's voice, it wasn't just a singular act. It wasn't just intended to make sure that we were sitting here on Sunday morning. That is not the extent of what God is talking about when Haggai says we need to obey the voice of the Lord. But it means to hear him. It means to trust him, to submit to him, and ultimately to surrender to him and his word. And then this amazing promise. He says it in chapter 1, verse 13, and also in chapter 2, verse 4. You know what happens when we get on this road to renewal, whether it was those people back then, whether it's us today, after we've given individual and collective careful thought to our ways, we've understood what the plan of action is to act upon that. We want to continue to obey the voice of the Lord. And then it's just real simple. I am with you. God says, I am with you. Makes us think about what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 8. If God is for us, who can be against us? And then you remember the words of Jesus in what we would call the Great Commission. Surely I'm with you always, to the very end of the age. And I could easily spend till midnight tonight just talking about other aspects of this, to read it and spend more time in it. But I would want you to notice just these very brief things that I'll kind of close with that have to do with what takes place when people actually take God so seriously that they realize that it's not just an occasional time of obedience or listening or submitting or doing things that have to do with kingdom work. But it's really interesting because it says in verse 14 that God stirred up the people. That in verses 4 or 5 of chapter 2 that he would encourage them to be strong. And as a result of that, when you are strong, you need to work. And that in verse 5 that his spirit is within us and that he would shake the nations. Isn't that an awesome thought, to think that we could be a part of helping shake the nations? It is a cultural phenomenon that really began last year. It's moved into this year. You've probably seen books about it. You've read articles about it. And it's called the Great Resignation. In February alone of this year, 4.3 million people quit their jobs, which is a little bit less than in November. But people seem to be quitting their jobs all over for whatever different kind of reason there is. And all I can say is, may that never be said of us. Others may be quitting, but we need to be renewed. We need to be standing up. Paul would say, always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor is not in vain. And he would go on to say, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest. May we collectively, may we enthusiastically say, unlike what was said in chapter 1, verse 2, that the time has come to rebuild the Lord's house. The time has come to be engaged again in kingdom work on a spiritual level to make a difference in people's lives. That time has come. That's what Renewal Sunday is all about. I am confident that as long as we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, Hebrews 12, verse 2, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and is sat down at the right hand of God. If we will keep our eyes focused on Jesus, then renewal will happen. We will no longer be in a self-imposed exile. We will no longer be living in a cocoon. Family and friends, the time has come. It is time for us to be renewed. It is time again for us to step up for God. There is probably no better time to really reflect on what it means to be fixing our eyes on Jesus than us partaking of the Lord's Supper. These emblems, this bread and this juice, remind us of the sacrifice of Jesus. It's what gives us our hope. It's what gives us our purpose. It's what should cause a great sense of gratitude within us. So we're going to take the Lord's Supper. If you're visiting with us today, you can either come up to one of these tables, or there's also some tables in the back. But we're going to reflect on Jesus, remembering that as long as we keep our eyes fixed on him, then renewal is possible and new opportunities are possible. Let's partake of the Lord's Supper.